Hello, everybody. As we head into 2026, the big issue, I think, for the year is the future of work. My guest today, Julia Hobsbawm, has become an authority in the future. She has a consultancy called workathon.io. And my sense is that she's rather pessimistic. In fact, more than pessimistic, she believes that in 2026, humans, or at least working humans, will face an existential crisis. Julia, is that right? Is 2026 going to be the existential crisis for working humans?
Well, I think it is really, because 2025 was is still the year for a little bit longer, where AI has been bigged up to the point, in the developing world anyway, where humans have been made to feel obsolete. And I don't think they've bought the message that it makes them run faster, farther, higher, quicker, with making their lives easier. I think humans are worried about how they work. I think there's lots of upsides to AI, but I think this is the biggest shift for working people in 150 years, without a doubt.
Yeah, I don't think there's any doubt about that. I mean, historians will look back and see this period as one of profound change, of revolution. But why would it be in 2026 versus 2027 or 2028? What do you expect to happen to start to trigger this supposed existential crisis for the working class in every sense?
Well, I think the moment has already been triggered. It was triggered really. The starting gun on this phase was triggered by COVID, followed by ChatGPT. And then obviously we're in a very geopolitically unstable moment. And I think it's no accident that the movie that won the best Oscar after COVID was Everything Everywhere All at Once, which was very much about kind of old human values, about love and laundry and new technology, and was a sort of hyper-tech film. And I think the world of work is experiencing an overwhelm and an overload. And I think that does cause an existential crisis about meaning. And when you add in Gen Z and their different value sets and the whole question of purpose, and there's just kind of...
Yeah, but you're not answering my question. I take your point in a broad sense, but why 2026? What's going to happen in the next 12 months that will actually trigger this crisis?
No, I'm saying I am answering your question. I'm saying the crisis has already been triggered, and 2026 will see a continuation of it. Now, there are some markers to look out for in 2026, but we've already had the shift to white collar work being treated in the same way as blue collar work. That is a shocking shift. We've already seen that higher education and further education, certainly in America, has not yielded the results of jobs for graduates. And there'll be a continuation of that. You've seen enormous layoffs in the big tech companies. So going into 2026, there is a pessimistic mood, although I'm a fully fledged optimist, but there is a pessimistic mood going forward, that the white collar class is under pressure. But there's also a pessimism, if you look at data from, say, the World Bank, that the developing economies aren't really being given their share of investments in the promise of new technology. So I think that it's not that it will see the beginning of this, it will see the continuation of it. And you add to it that we are on the brink of, not if not outright warlike times. Europe, America, Russia are in war voice with each other.
Yeah, but that's got nothing to do. I take your point on, and we've done many shows on China and Russia and the United States and autocracy versus democracy. But that's a separate issue, isn't it, from the future of work?
Well, I don't think it is at all. I mean, I think the supply chain crisis, the tariffs, geopolitics have all underscored the fact that, as one of my books is called Fully Connected, we are all fully and hyper connected. And so there's a crisis now around, where is the center of gravity for work? It always was America. You and I have talked about this before. The promise of work, the tone that America set for work is changing. radically as it enters its 250th anniversary year. So that is worrying, not only for Americans, but where is the center of gravity? And the geopolitics affect it massively. So I use the word existential deliberately because I think that the humans are feeling much more human, much more profoundly than they've done in regard to work. And I think that AI and the adoption of AI by big corporates and the communication of that has triggered this existential crisis of trust, of faith, and yeah, it's not a good moment. But do I think 2026 is a new moment? No, it's a continuation of it, and I don't think it's a good moment.
Are we likely, Julia, to have a 9/11 moment, maybe 2026? I mean, these things are impossible to predict. Or a Great Recession moment, a moment, Bear Stearns or something, where suddenly the global financial system totters on the edge of the ledge. Can you imagine something like that when it comes to work, or is it going to come in slow drips, sort of torturous drips of reports about more and more people being laid off by more and more corporations?
Well, I think would that we knew with crystal balls. We're only here now at the end of December trying to scene set. So
Well, you've
I
got
do.
the Christmas tree behind you. You should be able to get some otherworldly inspiration.
It's all very shiny and twinkly. Look, I would say that first of all, apropos continuation, we are in a new world and an old world. I've just seen the Jack Lemmon, Shirley MacLaine movie, The Apartment, made in 1960. And some of those themes about corporate life and office life and what's the real meaning, those have endured, and those actually haven't changed, even though the materiality of how people work has changed so much.
Although, to come back, it was a wonderful film. Come back
Yeah.
to that movie. All those women on the switchboard, they've all gone, haven't they?
Yeah, but history, modern history is littered with jobs that we did have and now we don't have, and indeed technology that we did have and we don't have. And so nobody uses the telex anymore, and nobody really uses smartphones blew out of the water. Older phones. So the new technology continues. To your point about, is an economic crisis going to be seismic in a one-stop moment? Well, possibly, but I don't think that's what's going to happen. I think the possibility of seismic shock that's most likely is in fact technological, which is cybersecurity and cybercrime, is not in control. And we've had lots of major outages. And if you look at the tech media, they are reporting that the CTO is now spending much more time than they ever were trying to mitigate damage or create firewalls. Or we've had extraordinary rise in major outages. So probably the biggest single risk to the world of work, quote unquote, is a technological outage that might be brief, but will be very damaging. I'm not saying that's going to happen in 2026, but there's an irony, isn't there, that you've got robotics and automation and AI reaching unimaginable heights of new things, and yet the cables being cut might be what does for people.
You have an interesting argument in terms of gig workers. You suggest that in 2026, we will see the appearance of what you call the executive gig worker. Who is that person, and why is this important in terms of the future of work?
So one of the things that has not been in the conversation as much as I thought it was going to be until now, and I think will be in 2026, is that the white collar world is becoming like shift workers de facto. It's becoming gig work, the job for life, the career path, the stable pension and benefits package is really disappearing, and countries are racing to catch up with tax policies and protection policies. Something like 50% of the American workforce will be freelance by 2030. And we're not talking restaurant shift workers. We're not talking factory shift workers. We're talking about everyone, everywhere, all at once being in the gig economy. And I think it's about time we talked about that, because that affects how you feel about work. So the Magritte image that I've used on that slide on the left is from 1954. That is that's the archetypal existential image of work to me, of the bowler-hatted men like drones falling through the sky.
Yeah, I mean, it's the apartment.
It is the apartment. It came out 6 years before the apartment. The image on the right, by the way, is what I asked ChatGPT to produce for my last book. And I think it's interesting that
And for people who are just listening, we have two images. We have the Rene Magritte raining humans on a suburb image, and then we have the ChatGPT image of, seems like women in bowler hats more than men,
yes,
for some reason.
yes.
I'm sure it's been programmed to represent as many women as men.
It has, although that image, when I asked ChatGPT for my 2023 book, Working Assumptions, was of course not as trained as it is now on ethnicity and diversity. And so it's actually white men and white women falling through the sky. And yes, apologies, Andrew, for your listeners. The point about existentialism in art and culture is it picks up what we are feeling, humans, about work. And I think what's different for 2026 potentially is that the corporate world has sent the wrong signal to its own workers and is going to have to row back. And I note that Davos, the World Economic Forum, which still has its mojo, that the convening slogan for 2026 is the spirit of dialogue. And what that actually means, I think, is the dialogue of bosses and workers, because there's a real lack of trust, there's a real lack of confidence.
Coming back to this idea of the gig worker and the white collar gig worker, is one of the contradictions, Julia, and that to train to be a lawyer or an engineer or accountant is actually, particularly in the United States, is incredibly expensive. I mean, you want to go to law school, it's going to cost you several $100,000. And if indeed the future of white collar lawyers, for example, or all lawyers are white collar, the future of lawyers is the gig economy. And they're the equivalent of Uber drivers or Lyft drivers in the 2020s and 2030s, then it doesn't make any sense to go to law school in economic terms. No one's going to invest hundreds of thousands of dollars so that they can be paid by the hour.
I think that's absolutely right, Andrew. And I think part of the crisis of work is that both by its own hand and by the market of the professions, the education path for many would-be leaders and for people into the professions has been disrupted to the point that some feel it doesn't pay back and might even be worthless. So in education, which is being altered so fundamentally by AI, you've got a situation where reskilling has got to take place constantly. So the idea that you've done your qualifications from A to Z over a period of time, and then whoopee, you can work your way up and you can get a better life. So the white collars feel as betrayed as the blue collars do. I always like to reference the present moment against some cultural landmarks. And it's interesting that we are having a throwback now in the white collar world to the world of the 2008 and even before, when the blue collars were jettisoned overboard in offshoring. Billy Joel's Allentown is an incredible, if you listen to the lyrics of that song, the qualifications hang on the wall and they weren't really worth it at all. That's a sensibility. But let's forget that the blue collar workers are also in trouble because the automated worker is being even more automated with robotics. So you have a crisis of work anyway, and leaders don't seem yet to be giving the message to their workforces, that they know what the answer is. So they are all over the place. I think it's ultimately a political and management and leadership question, and an economic one. It's
Julia,
culture.
I know you enjoy my weekly tech show with Keith Tier,
I do. I'm a big fan of your discussions.
the gruff Yorkshireman with the belief in progress.
I think he's smart. I think he's smart, but I think he's very smart. I really enjoy Keith's take. And well, I worry that there's a sort of aerial view that investors
right. Well,
take.
that's what I was going to ask. I mean, as you know, and I hope some of our listeners at least know, Keith believes that all this is a good thing because it will liberate us finally from work and we'll be free in a sort of utopian Marxist sense to realize our humanity because technology will free us from work. Is that an argument? And it is an argument that you hear in Silicon Valley from people like Keith Tier, Julia, and others, not just in Silicon Valley. Is that going to be an argument, an idea that gains any currency in 2026? Bernie Sanders recently called for a moratorium on data centers, which doesn't seem as if Bernie's on board with the abundance agenda of Keith Tier and others.
Well, yeah, I mean, is it the abundance agenda if you're referring to the Derek Thompson, Ezra Klein book?
I mean in a broader sense, they're more practical and policy oriented.
I was going to say, I mean, I'm all for the abundance of that particular book in terms of saying let's actually organize society better, by the way. But is Keith Tier really arguing for universal basic income? That's not what I've heard him argue for, but what he does seem to have is a sort of you can't make an omelette without breaking eggs argument. And my point is that, okay, if that's the case, then you can expect pushback, uprisings, if not outright strikes. Then you're going to see even more sickness, illness, low productivity. You might, however, see, I don't think it's likely, but you might see white collar uprisings in the same way that you saw when the second industrial revolution really ushered in the end of the artisan era. But white collar workers are becoming like artisan craftspeople, you see. And that's what I think is a scary moment. And I don't like the way the investment community is trying to sort of be grandiose about it. I want to be granular and focus on the humans, because we are all people with feelings, with hinterlands, with economic
some of us. Speak for yourself, Julia. I banned Keith using the H word, humans, but you're allowed to use it.
Well, I think
Brian Merchant, a local writer here, had an influential book, I think it was last year or the year before, called Blood in the Machine, about the Luddites. Are we likely, you touched on this just before, are we likely to experience, I mean, are all these underpaid gig lawyers and engineers and accountants, are they going to go out on the streets and they're going to riot?
Well, no,
they're going to burn Google and OpenAI down.
No, they're not. But I think their voting intentions are changing, and so that's where you get the geopolitics, the national politics, and then, if you like, the work politics, and certainly the office politics. So the questions about inequality. You know. I've talked to you once before about the fact that I think Henry Ford remains such a significant figure in the Ford Motor Company, and next year is going to be the 100th anniversary of the introduction of the 5-day week. And what's interesting about that is even the most red in tooth and claw capitalist of the old era that we appear to be leaving behind has appreciated the human sensibility of his workforce. So Henry Ford began with the Taylorist, let's treat humans like drones and worker bees and, parts of the machine. And he he ended up realizing that if he wanted a consumer society, if you want your workers to consume what they make, if you want them to not be too exhausted to make what they sell, let alone buy, you have to understand them more as humans. And what worries me is a sort of sensibility is coming in that the tech's inevitable, universal basic income is inevitable. Humans will do what we tell them. Those of us in the positions to make these decisions, that I'm not so sure about.
You have a reading suggestion, which not everyone would be familiar with. Émile Durkheim, the great French sociologist, well, actually, it was written in 1893. The division of labor in society. What new wisdom does a late 19th century French sociological text bring to the 2020s?
Well, it's interesting, Andrew, because I was at dinner the other night with an investor of a pretty large family office, the kind of person who puts hundreds of millions of dollars into infrastructure projects. And they sort of said, why do you talk about these reports and things that were published 100 years ago? We're talking about now. It's like, hello, if you look and read Émile Durkheim's the time he was writing and what he was writing about how can you keep society together if the workforce that is building this great new future is just shucked off like it's irrelevant. So for me, we are entering an era of ethics, philosophy, morality, and power playing more of a part, as it ever did, by the way. If times are good, if people's salaries go up, if they can afford the cost of living, if they can afford the childcare, if they're consuming, if they're not being hated on by their own leaders, immigrants to a country being told that they are a blight on that country. If people
who are you talking? I can't imagine who you're talking about, Julia.
But all over the world, actually. I'm not just talking about who you think I'm talking about, okay? I'd quite like to keep
You're
my
not talking about Nigel Farage, I thought you were.
What I'm saying is that there is an interesting moment of casual disrespect from leaders politically and corporately to their own workers. 1 minute, everyone cares in a cuddly way about their workforces. Everybody talks the talk about inclusion and helping people get on in life. And the next minute is they're all lazy, they're all a drain on us, they're all useless, and we're going to replace them with machines. Well, humans are not going to like that. And so what I'm interested in is showing, and we show our clients, the historical trend, the contemporary trend, and then we ask them to put their own inquiry into action and answer the problem. Are we handling this the right way? And the answer is generally not, which is good for business. And so what I don't want is anybody's aerial view, Keith Tears or otherwise. I'm not saying what happened in 1893 is exactly the same as 2026, but I'm saying, well, that was when a new enlarged workforce was being formed and an old, smaller workforce was being dismantled. What happened then? What was the culture then? Why would we not look back to look forward? Maybe it's because I'm the daughter of a historian, Andrew. I think we've discussed
that. We're gonna come on to that. I always bring that up. I know it annoys you, but I'm still going to do it. I'm reading. I take all your points and I agree with you, but is any of this new? I'm rereading J.G. Ballard's great turn of the century novel Kingdom Come, about the increasing, and it's set in the home counties around London, about their sort of reactionary white middle class and their hatred of immigrants, which seems to capture what Farage is doing or what Trump is doing in the US or Orban in Hungary and so on and so forth. I take your point on work and all the added pressures and anxiety, but none of this is that new. I mean, it's been going on for at least a quarter of a century. And of course, if you go back to the 20th century, your father would remind us of this, it was very much a feature of the 1930s. In fact, it shaped the world that we're now reinventing.
Well, I think we are agreeing that nothing is new, but there's always a new context. Okay, so clearly we are in a new moment of automation. Clearly, the white collar worker that has only really existed for a very short period of time historically is suddenly fighting for their survival in the same way that the Luddites and the weavers did, and in the same way that the blue-collar workers have done. Now, that's a new moment, but compared to the introduction of the first wave of modern technology, we can see some parallels. And my point is that the way the world works, but the way the world of work works has always needed different strategies and paying different attention. And I think there's a lot to gain for organizations to really look differently at what they're communicating. I mean, the buzzword all over LinkedIn, if you're into LinkedIn, which actually I am, if you're into LinkedIn, the buzzword is now that, it's all about storytelling. Now, I agree, but what does that mean?
Yeah, that's one
What
of
does
the
that
worst.
mean?
I mean, anyone who brings up stories is immediately banned from my show. I mean, it's the oldest cliche in the world. Let's go back to your
Well,
father.
hang on, but Andrew, but wait a second. What it means is that narrative is important.
But that goes without saying. It's the most obvious thing. Why do
No,
people need to?
because a fatal underestimation has been made in the last few years by leaders of political parties and corporations and organizations, which is to create a narrative that disregards people's feelings. So you look at the Labour Party in the UK, it's in great difficulty despite having a massive majority, because it started to put in policies that that gave a narrative and a message and told a story to people that they didn't matter. And so narrative does matter, storytelling does matter, and there are shifts from one moment to the next, but you have to change. You can't just talk about it.
Right. Well, one of the great storytellers was your father, Eric Hobsbawm, a historian, but he told stories about history. He's probably the leading storyteller of the industrial age. A man who's controversial, certainly for his sympathies towards left-wing revolution. What do you think? Two questions on your father. Firstly, he was a sophisticated enough thinker to recognize that an existential crisis for one class was an opportunity for another. So every existential crisis is built into history. It's the nature of things. Anytime you ever look at history or tell a historical story, you will always be able to find the story of existential crisis and existential opportunity. And the second question is really about work and the working class. Your father was a great believer in the promise of the working class. What do you think he would make of technology that logically at least seems to be doing away with work? What would your father think about a post-work world?
Well, you won't be surprised by me as a feminist, nearly 62-year-old, Andrew, to say I have no idea what my father would say. He died in 2012, but I get your point. And I mean, I my father, of course, influenced me, but I'm not looking at the world through his eyes, and so I don't know. And I'm an entrepreneur. I'm a businesswoman, so I'm seen as a traitor by some who think that capitalism can be dismantled and that everything will be fine. I don't think that. And in fact, what worries me, and I think my father would probably agree, but I don't know, and scholars of my father might have a much better take. But my father, I think, believes, as certainly I do, I believe that work is part of the fabric of society, that work should be well paid, that you should be educated, that you should definitely have leisure and time off. But the idea that the apex of modernity is to let machines do jobs so that humans can't work at all, that's not progress in my mind. Now, take your point that different losses and gains and that power structures change. But I am worried by a sensibility that says it is inevitable and desirable that the fundamental structures in any way that work is organized is to dismantle human agency. And, augmented and embodied are important phrases to unpick and unpack. I'd love to talk about that with you and Keith Teare. I think you should make that happen.
Well, you don't need me. Keith can make it happen. You can make it happen. We'll definitely do that. Maybe live or in person in the Bay Area in the spring.
That would be good. I mean, I'm not trying to duck the question, but I honestly don't know. What do you think? I think the most important thing is.
I'm asking you.
Well,
I'm not asking in an academic sense, but you spent many years with him. He was clearly a man who.
Well, we disagreed on some things. I mean, he liked technology. He was a bit of a gadget man after he died. My goodness, there was lots of things with cables and headphones and this, that, and the other. Look, I don't think anybody other than a very small proportion of people in Silicon Valley genuinely believe that humanity is best served by humans becoming
and that's the irony, I think, of all this. Is I had Branko Milanovic, another very smart guy, an economist, former lead researcher at the World Bank, on the show just before Christmas, and he noted that one of the distinctive things about today's inequality is that the dominant class or caste in Silicon Valley, they enjoy work, so they're not retiring. They want to work, and of course they want to put their money to work too. But in previous civilizations, the kind of wealth that this class had, they'd buy a big country house like the capitalists did in England and join the aristocracy and acquire titles and aristocratic wives or husbands. But this new class doesn't. So they want to work hard. And yet, on the other hand, of course, they want to put the rest of us out of work.
Well, I think this new class, as you put it, is developing some worrying beliefs that there are two kinds of people. What Imelda Marcos used to call the little people. And I mean, you have to reject that notion. I mean, it doesn't matter what your politics are. If you genuinely believe that some people deserve less because they are, fill in the blanks, less intelligent, or they believe in God less. I mean, that's a recipe for absolute disaster. So we have to pull back from that. The other thing is that, with the greatest of respect to America and the American way of work and all that California has offered the world, there is also a narrative, a story that California is becoming genuinely the epicenter of the future of work. Well, this is obviously nonsense. Why do people keep talking about that? Has anyone looked at the rest of the world? Has anybody looked at different countries and different practices? And so my view is that there is a false narrative emerging. And you can't just say, oh yeah, well, gold is going up, so that means that's the story now. We have to take a more rounded view. And I certainly think, even though I'm a pale imitation of him, my late father would have thought the same on that, I'm sure.
Let's end, Julia, with some concrete ideas about 2026. Does agency still exist? I mean, we're talking as if all this stuff's inevitable. There are a lot of people who argue that all this new technology, this AI technology, will create new kinds of jobs, many of which we haven't even imagined. There were the same fears in the industrial age, and that didn't do away with employment.
Right. Let's end on some optimism. I think there are three things to be optimistic about. One is youth and what I call the amazing generation of alphas, millennials, and Zeds who begin their journey in 2026 to dominating the global workforce. And the reason why I'm optimistic is that they do have a fresh way of looking at the world. They are much more embedded in digital technology than the outgoing older generations. And it's going to be an important time for dialogue, actually, between the generations. And that makes me optimistic. The second reason why,
in spite of all their anxiety and lots of people write about them not wanting to work very hard. And
there's lots of, I mean, it's about it's about a different kind of dialogue of understanding what gets work done, what works, and actually listening to what doesn't work for workers is a good way to start. I mean, that makes me optimistic. The second is that there really are a large number of what we at Workathon call trendsetters embedded throughout politics, throughout the corporate world, throughout academia. And we are going to call out, like, what does success looks like? We need to share the good news. And the good news is there's good news. There are trendsetters pioneering in small ways and large ways, new ways of working and getting what we want. And then the third point is that the human does have to be factored in. The human cannot be comprehensively replaced, will not be comprehensively replaced. And coming back to your concern about a bubble popping, maybe, but one thing appears to be the case, that the humans' limitations have been over-indexed by some Silicon Valley investors, and the capabilities of the machine talked up. And at the very least, you need both. So
it's interesting that all these three things you mentioned, you didn't talk politics at all. Is there a political movement, just as there was a political movement emerging at the beginning of the 19th century, to represent the new working class? Is it conceivable?
No, there's not. And in fact, that's one of the things I'm trying to do at Workathon, is really bring together the different players. I mean, I talk to people at the World Bank, I talk to people at the EU, I talk to people in the FTSE, I talk to people all over the world, leaders, but also people who have not yet in their careers. And the dialogue and the understanding and the roadmap is not there. And that's what we need. I'm in the very early stages, Andrew, of forming the World Work Organization. We need a global approach to work. We need to take off the old limited thinking, but we can't do it if we think there's only one way of work. We can't do it if we think the only measurement is stock market, and we can't do it if we think the future of work is entirely emanating first and foremost from America.
Well, the idea of a working party seems a little old-fashioned. Why not have a leisure party?
I feel like it's not that human beings want leisure, they want fairness. They don't want inequality.
Well, speak for yourself, Julia Hobsbawm. We will expect great things from you in your excellent workathon.io. You're leading the charge to think about our brave new world. Happy New Year, Julia. And we'll get you on with Keith, and you can set him right in the spring.